what you did do was put on one of the most reprehensible, narcissistic defenses that I have ever seen in my years of trial work. And may God have mercy on your souls, because this court will not.
A West Virginia couple will spend the rest of their lives in prison after adopting 5 children, only to subject them to unimaginable horrors, including being locked inside of a shed for days and forced to perform grueling labor. But thanks to those who refuse to stay silent, these monsters will never walk free again. I'm going to speak with civil rights attorney Joe Richardson to dive into this truly disturbing case. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, so I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. This is a story of a nightmare that was disguised as a home. It is a case that is so brutal and upsetting that it has drawn national outrage. Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz, a white West Virginia couple, adopted 5 black children, but not to love them, no, to abuse them in what prosecutors referred to as, quote, modern-day slavery. Their crimes? Human trafficking, child torture, forced labor. It is a level of cruelty that is so extreme. And last week, justice was served when these two were sentenced collectively to a punishment that exceeds 3 lifetimes, meaning they will die behind bars. And that sentencing marked the end of a harrowing case that began back in October of 2023, when a home health worker 911 call exposed the extent of what was going on inside this house, where the children, then aged 5 to 16, were imprisoned, starved, and forced to work like, quote, slaves on the couple's rural Sissonville property. But the real story lies in what those children endured and how they survived. So I want to go back to that October evening in 2023 when this house of horrors was uncovered. At 5:46 p.m. on October 2nd, a home health worker made this urgent call to the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office.
He has 2 kids locked in an outbuilding. They've been in there for days.
And what deputies found when they responded was absolutely horrifying. According to an official news release from the sheriff's office, quote, deputies had to force entry into the barn where they located a juvenile male and juvenile female locked inside an approximate 20 by 14 foot room. The children had no means to exit the barn on their own, no running water, no bathroom facilities, and were obviously deprived of adequate hygienic care and food. But the horror didn't end there. Inside the main house, deputies made another startling discovery. According to the release, at the main residence, deputies located another small child locked inside alone. The child was observed in an unprotected loft approximately 15 feet high. So Lantz and Whitefeather, they later arrived, were subsequently arrested, hit with a felony charge of gross child neglect of a child, resulting in the substantial risk of injury. Later, the charges were upgraded when they were dealt with a whopping 20-count indictment, including human trafficking, child abuse, using a minor for labor. By the time they stood trial, they faced 35 counts. And before we go any further into this, I want to bring on friend of the show, civil rights attorney Joe Richardson. Joe, thanks so much for coming on. This is such a terrible case. Initial impressions, initial thoughts on this one?
Oh my gosh, where do you even go? I mean, it's clear that these children were treated subhumanly in a way where there's no gray area. There's no, there's no 2 ways about it. There's so much that doesn't make sense here, particularly as it pertains to the idea that someone has actually been adopted and therefore you're supposed to care for these siblings and care for these kids and give them something that they're missing. And there's no 2 ways about what actually was happening to them, because we saw what we saw between the video, the things at the house. It's just problem all the way around, and that they're treated subhumanly. And the only way to describe it is, yes, they're treated like slaves.
What are the civil rights laws that are triggered here? Because again, you don't see these kind of allegations very often, at least from my perspective, in child abuse cases.
Yeah, I mean, boy, where do you start? So theoretically, what you can argue are that the civil rights of these children basically have been taken by their parents. It's kind of strange because you don't normally see it. Normally, the allegations are the criminal side allegations against the parents related to child abuse, related to child neglect and things like that. But is there a way to argue that the children had liberty taken away from them and those types of things in a case that would be against the parents. Well, that's not going to go very far. But could something be said about the agencies that were supposed to be looking after them? If they find information that would demonstrate it, they've been investigated for a while. They had been investigated for a while in the previous place that they lived. Is there potential for there to be something brought because these particular folks missed the ball?
Well, here's the thing, right? Mm-hmm. These parents are understanding past home studies, adoption screenings, homeschooling the kids. Is there a problem in the vetting process?
There's an argument that there's a problem in the vetting process, but at the very least, there were investigations once they had the children. There were already claims that there were problems that way. And normally, though, it's harder to get a public entity, like it would be the state, a state agency, a county agency, for liability unless they breach a mandatory duty that is statutory. So you can't just sue them for garden variety common law negligence. But if you can show that they had some obligation in the law statutorily that they did not meet, then maybe you have something there, and it would certainly be worth looking at in this case.
By the way, we were able to find criminal histories for both Whitefeather and Lantz on Truthfinder, the powerful background checker. So we just put in their names and state, West Virginia, located their profiles in just a few seconds. And under their criminal histories, we found these charges for child neglect. Now, Law&Crime, we partner with Truthfinder. We use it to get details on people involved in our stories. But even if you don't work in true crime, this can be an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. It's one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with a paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. So right now, if you're interested, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. So let's go now to January's explosive trial. So prosecutors laid out a disturbing pattern of racial targeting and abuse. And the evidence showed that they adopted these children from a Minnesota homeless shelter before moving them across state lines to Washington and then West Virginia, where the abuse had escalated. And jurors even saw damning proof of forced labor and psychological torture, including surveillance footage showing children being punished by standing motionless for hours with their hands on their heads. Now, what were the defense's claims? Well, Whitefeather's attorney, Mark Plants, called the shed where the deputies found the malnourished children a, quote, teen clubhouse. And I want you to listen to this argument from a preliminary hearing.
There's a key inside, and the 14 and 16 want their teenage clubhouse. They go down there and play around.
Now, this explanation collapsed under scrutiny because the 911 caller directly contradicted Plants, testifying she saw Lantz lock the children inside. Neighbors also took the stand, describing how they'd suspected abuse from the moment the family moved into the neighborhood. One emotional witness explained why she contacted Child Protective Services.
I was afraid that they would move away and those little kids, nobody would be there to help them.
And when Whitefeather and Lantz took the stand, their testimony painted a starkly different picture. Whitefeather claimed she was a devoted mother who cooked, cleaned, did most of the farm work herself. She denied all abuse allegations, doubling down on the teen hangout story.
I'm his mommy. I mean, they can disown me, but I will never disown them. As far as I'm concerned, they're my children.
You love all your children.
I love all my children.
And when Donald Lantz took the stand, he painted himself and Whitefeather as overwhelmed parents simply trying their best, explained that one of the couple's children had mental health issues that they were trying to manage. But the jury had already seen damning evidence that told a very different story, including text messages where the couple referred to their black children as, and I'm very sorry to say this, monkeys. That's what they said. Mocked them, discussed physical punishments. Don't you know that digital evidence really hard to argue against? And in one particularly disturbing exchange, they used the initials PB to describe one child, meaning P-boy, P-brain, psycho boy. Here's how Lantz attempted to explain these messages.
You know, after the 100th time that your 10 to 13-year-old kid, you know, wets his pants, you know, it gets a little bit frustrating because every time it takes time, you have to get him cleaned up, change his clothes, or get his clothes changed, and it gets frustrating.
Joe, back to you. I mean, what do you want to hit first? The surveillance footage, the witnesses, the text messages? Was it a foregone conclusion that they were going to be convicted of a lot of these charges?
Yeah, it actually was, because they had the receipts, as folks like to say so much. They were able to use these guys' own camera footage. You know what I mean? No, this is your footage. And of course, from the very beginning, neighbors saw that there were some things that were going on that shouldn't be going on. And then you add the texts that can't be, sometimes people say, well, you text without context. Well, you've got full conversations where they're calling these kids out of their name. They're calling these kids something that they shouldn't be calling them if they actually care about them. So they're really able, it's very damning. It's not just people looking through the window and seeing some problems, even though that was there. It's their own actions, their own words, the things that they're saying that there's no gray area for. It's one thing if you're a little hard on the child or something and you're explaining it that way. They say you're teaching them discipline. You're teaching them discipline by calling them monkeys. What discipline are you teaching by having them stand for hours with their hands on their heads? What discipline are you teaching by them not being able to go to the bathroom? There's no excuse for it, and there's no gray area for it. So they were going to get convicted.
A tough case to defend. I mean, during sentencing, my understanding is the judge criticized them for their defense, chastised them for their lack of remorse. Why do you think they took the stand?
I guess they figured they wouldn't be any worse off for having done it, but it's a continued, it's up to them. Maybe it was against their attorney's advice, but it's also the potential for continued delusion, a continuation of the delusion that they've been in the entire time. So even though the evidence is damning, okay, there's still the matter of whether or not your explanation insults intelligence. And they really did that. I can imagine the jury was probably angry by hearing it. You call it a clubhouse? You didn't have to call it a clubhouse if it wasn't on text that it was called a clubhouse, or if it wasn't on video that it was called clubhouse. Why would you make that up? We all know it's not a clubhouse. So they made a lot of bad decisions in their testimony. They probably knew they'd have the book thrown at them anyway. But even if they're going to testify, which is rare, there's a question of how you testify. And the way that they testified really insulted the jury and the judge's intelligence.
And a few things here. I mean, first of all, I got to call out the people around here, the neighbors, the home health worker decided to get involved, alert CPS to what was happening. Lantz had made the argument that, one of the children peed his pants, that this was frustrating, but these were children who were subjected to extended periods of time without even having access to a toilet, among other horrors, such as only being given peanut butter sandwiches, staying in dirty clothes. It compiled. Now, here's the thing. I want to go to the end of this case. So during closing arguments, Whitefeather's attorney argued that this was simply a case of bad parenting, that this was not racial animus. But prosecutor Madison Tuck dismantled that argument in her powerful closing argument.
I want to remind you that defendant Whitefeather and defendant Lantz made a bet when they chose to move to Sissonville, West Virginia. They bet that people of West Virginia would not care if they mistreated their black children right out in front of the world. I ask you to prove them wrong.
And prove them wrong the jury did, delivering guilty verdicts on 31 of the 35 counts.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Jeanne K. Whitefeather, guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of human trafficking of a minor child. We, the jury, find the defendant, Donald Ray Lantz, guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of human trafficking of a minor child.
And so the convictions included human trafficking of a minor, civil rights violations, forced child labor, severe child abuse. Whitefeather was convicted of all 19 counts against her, including civil rights violations, while Lantz was convicted of 12 of the 16 counts against him. So the jury didn't find him guilty of 4 counts of civil rights violations. And when sentencing came on March 19th, the children, who are now safe in foster care, faced their tormentors. And their words cut through the courtroom, with one child saying, "Don't call her my mother, please. That's my only request to you. Her name is Jeanne or Miss Whitefeather." Another child saying, "I will be something amazing. I will be strong and beautiful. You will always be exactly what you are, horrible." Judge Mary Claire Ackers delivered the final blow, sentencing Whitefeather to 215 years behind bars and Lantz to 160 years behind bars.
And instead of apologizing today, because you never have said you're sorry, Even though, Miss Whitefeather, you say you made some mistakes, but you're not sorry for them. And Mr. Lantz, I didn't hear you apologize either when you had the opportunity. But what you did do was put on one of the most reprehensible, narcissistic defenses that I have ever seen in my years of trial work. And may God have mercy on your souls, because this court will not.
Now, the couple was also ordered to pay $280,000 each in restitution for the children's future therapy and medical care. Joe, why do you think that they were convicted, and why do you think Lantz wasn't convicted across the board? You know, I find it interesting in these kinds of cases when the evidence is so bad and egregious that if you have a jury who doesn't just automatically convict across the board, to me it signals they carefully looked at the evidence, and that makes their decision, you know, even more supported, even stronger. But why do you think they were convicted, and why do you think he wasn't convicted of some of those civil rights violations?
Well, clearly they were thoughtful, right? And so it would be, you know, no one would have questioned this if they just said, listen, let's just sit around and have a lollipop and just find these guys guilty on everything. But they followed where the evidence took them, compared it to the elements of each of the causes of action. And it may be because of some level of decreased involvement as it pertains to a particular thing that lends to the civil rights cause of action itself, that they didn't get dad on all of those elements. Maybe one or two people on the jury weren't quite as sure. I am certain there might have been a couple of people who've been like, gosh, we can convict them of this. But technically speaking, as it pertains to this cause of action related to the civil rights violations, for what we saw, maybe we saw Mom Whitefeather here, but we didn't see Lantz here with this and this particular thing. So a little bit technical, but it also shows how thoughtful they were.
When you hear a combined 375-year prison sentence, my understanding is maybe life in prison is just not an automatic punishment for these charges, but you combine all the convictions together, right? And that's how you come up with that number. What does that significance of that number mean to you? Because a lot of people say, you know, 100 years in prison, 200 years in prison, 160 years in prison. Like, we look at life in prison, but sometimes the number is more impactful than just saying life in prison. There's something about that number. What did you take away from that, from the amount of time they're going to be behind bars?
Well, it shows that what they did was egregious, right? And it's recognized as egregious by the judge. I believe, as it pertains to both of them, and I don't want to get them mixed up, that theoretically they could qualify for parole. It would be many decades down the road, and I don't know that they actually will. But it's also a technical formula as well. You're at X number of years. Based on this, you could qualify for parole after Y number of years. So there's a technical formula component, but the number of years that acts as several hundred years, first of all, speaks to two things. First of all, that it's totally egregious. Second of all, that there's no way, even if there was a technical possibility of getting parole at some point before they were dead, you know it's not going to happen.
How does, when you hear the kids speak, right, you know, don't call her my mother, you get an insight into the psychological damage this did as well, right?
Yeah. These kids are never going to get over this. Some things that you can't get over, but you have to get through. So they'll need lifelong mental health care. That doesn't mean they can't live productive lives. That doesn't mean that they can't turn this negative situation into their own best positive outcome, but you never get over something like this. You just have to get through it a day at a time and push through and try to exact forgiveness in a situation where someone is not saying sorry and is not in a position to be or to deserve forgiveness. You've got to forgive them anyway, just so that you can live the best life you can and let them go so that you can therefore move forward. And it's very, very hard for someone that is so naturally aggrieved and has a right to be aggrieved. They've got a right to be mad for the rest of their lives, mad at the world, mad at everybody. But for them to be productive, they're going to have to find a way to move forward. And it's going to be very, very hard.
And I'll tell you, look, you know, these two I don't see any option where they're getting out of prison. I mean, I don't think they're ever going to
It'll never happen.
step out of prison ever again. And these children, are going to move on with their lives. You heard one say that they're going to be amazing. We wish them nothing but success and love and the best. But really, you got to also call out the people around them who refused to look away and spoke out and testified and called 911. So listen, Joe Richardson, tough case. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was great seeing you.
Good seeing you, Jesse. Thanks much.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.